Why is too much inflation a problem? Well, if we have too much inflation, it can wreak havoc on your economy. For an example, let's look at Zimbabwe. From 2000 to 2006, the Zimbabwe government reclaimed a bunch of foreign-owned farms. So prior to this, most of the agriculture was foreign-owned, and in order to create more opportunities for Zimbabwean people, the Zimbabwe government took ownership of all of these farms. Now, when they took ownership of these farms, they did it without compensating the foreigners. And the primary export in Zimbabwe is tobacco. So after they took possession of all these farms, well, the problem was is immediately after that, there was no one to run these farms. And so their exports, which is primarily tobacco, the crop was, production dropped to about a third of what it was. Well, this is problematic for the country, because if you're not producing one of your primary goods, that means there's not jobs for people. And so the unemployment rate started to skyrocket. If people didn't have jobs, they didn't have money, and so they're not buying other goods and services. Well, to help resolve this issue, the Zimbabwe government borrowed money from the International Monetary Fund. Now, the economy didn't pick back up because, again, there was still a minimal production of a lot of this farmland through this transition period. And so the money they borrowed from the International Monetary Fund to keep the economy afloat, even though their gross domestic product had dropped drastically, when that money became due, they couldn't pay it back. And so Zimbabwe printed money. They printed money to help pay back the International Monetary Fund. They printed money to help pay employees of the government, to help pay the police, soldiers, etc. Well, by this time, the unemployment rate was at 95%. And the problem is when you have a high unemployment rate, you tend to have unrest within your country, right? People want jobs, they want to have money, so they can buy the things they need. So the government needed to pay soldiers and police to keep them on the job, to keep some of that unrest from getting out of hand. And so the government actually increased the police and soldier wages by about 300%. Well, how do you afford to pay public employees more when the rest of your economy is not making more money and paying more? Well, they printed money to do so. And so what we have is Zimbabwe printing more and more money. Well, by 2008, they had 14.93 billion% inflation. So then they stopped counting. By this point, they had hyperinflation. So prices had gone up, out of control. And what they did at the time is they removed 10 zeros from their money to help lower the size of the bills you would need to, say, buy a loaf of bread. Well, they kept seeing more inflation. Again, they kept printing more money in order to continue to keep the economy running, even though their gross domestic product had dropped drastically and the unemployment rate was high. So this is Zimbabwe money. This is a $100 trillion bill, and this is after they removed 10 zeros for their currency. Well, in 2009, this money was worth about 33 cents. Wouldn't even buy a loaf of bread. So can you imagine how much money you would have needed to buy those basic food and necessities to get by? So everything was so expensive. Businesses couldn't afford to pay their employees. People didn't have the money they needed to buy goods and services, and the economy comes grinding to a halt. By 2009, they again removed 12 zeros from their currency, still seeing inflation, still having to print more money in order to pay people to keep the economy going because they weren't producing more goods and services. By that point, the German company who printed their money refused to print anymore. They just couldn't keep up with how much money was needed, and so they stopped printing money. By mid-2009, the Zimbabwe economy couldn't function based on their own currency. And in 2009, in Zimbabwe, if you wanted to buy anything, they were only accepting US dollars. Well, the end of 2016, Zimbabwe is now back on their own currency, but the problem is that people don't trust it. They're not confident that in a couple months it'll buy what it bought before. And so they're trying to make the transition back to their own money after seeing huge hyperinflation.